Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I am John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. Darker topic. Let's do it. People of Reddit who have discovered a dead body. What was your immediate reaction? Little not safe for work. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. I was watching a movie with my girlfriend and suddenly heard a loud crash. I used to be trained in first aid and CPR, so I jumped up and walked outside to try to see if there was anything I could do. I wasn't the first on the scene, but I was the first to check out if the driver was okay. I noticed that the glass on the windshield was cracked at about head height, and no seatbelt was worn, nor were there airbags deployed. Nothing felt right, and there was a feeling of dread that I can only describe as empty, with a side of heavy. The man was slouched over to his right, appeared to be about late 50s, early 60s, and the primary thing I noticed that confused me was that his veins in his arms looked as though he was still flexing. There was nothing I could do, as there was no pulse, no breathing, and a clear traumatic brain injury that even had he been alive, it wouldn't have looked great long term. So when I was about 15, I went to school to take my final exam. I was late due to my bus being in traffic and had to walk through a few streets after getting to my stop. At around midway, there's this guy crossing the street gets hit by a car going 50 in a school zone. The primary school was the side of my school. He went over the car and fell on the ground with a crack. Car drives away. At that point, I went to check it out and was already panicking. He was still breathing for a while after the crash, for about 5 minutes, and then he just died. I called 112 and tried to explain the situation as I was hyperventilating. Apparently, he had broken his spine and had a lot of internal bleeding. I did not do the exam. Was beside my mom's bed when she died. I just somehow knew it was close, so I stayed there and waited. After her last breath, I just sat by her for a bit, thinking she was now in peace, and past the pain and struggle of a body that was progressively shutting down from old age. Called out for the nurse to come in and confirm she was gone. My dad, I found on the floor at our old family home a couple of days too late, almost 5 years later. Called my wife and then the authorities and sat on the front step feeling guilty, a bit lost and finally annoyed. I was angry and frustrated that he always point-blank refused to have one of those medical alert pendants, and I hadn't been there over the weekend. I'm still dealing with the remnants of that 15 months later. I have a story. I didn't physically see him, but I smelled the body. I worked at a 55-plus independent apartment living community. It is not assisted living, but rather for active adults. When I first started, I was told about a resident named Charles. He was a diagnosed paranoid schizophrenic with many health problems and did not take care of himself. He absolutely should not have been there, but rather an assisted living facility. However, we cannot do anything about it. I first met Charles when I had to go to his apartment for him to sign some paperwork regarding his lease. His apartment reeked of old food and human waste. There was garbage on the floor. You couldn't see the countertops due to all of the junk, and the vinyl was sticky when you walked on it. It was so frustrating to see. He had caregivers, but would constantly fire them after a few sessions because he began to think they were poisoning his food, scamming him, etc. So he would lock them out and not let them in. Fast forward a few months, and I began to form some sort of bond with him because I constantly had to call him to remind him of rent and when I could come up to his apartment to pick it up. He was the only one who physically did not leave his apartment for at least 2 years, and I would have to pick up his check from him. He was an incredibly stubborn and rude man who you could not get through to him, but I saw him as a vulnerable, lonely man who had no friends or family and needed help. It was time for him to sign his lease renewal, so I called to ask if I could come to his apartment to have him sign it. I walked in and had to go to his bedroom, where he spent his entire remaining years in his hospital bed watching TV and ordering junk from infomercials. There was trash everywhere and human feces near the bathroom. I crouched by his bed as he signed his lease, and he began to tell me he used to be a chef. and misses the ability to cook. I listened to him and let him talk because I know it must have been years since he had an actual, heartfelt conversation with a human. I remember feeling in awe that he wasn't being an asshole, and at one point, I saw him smile. I left, and a few weeks later, he called down to the office to ask a question. He usually would call to gripe and then hang up. But when I answered, he asked if it was me, asked for my name, and asked how I was doing. I put a smile on my face because I was genuinely shocked he took the time to ask a simple question like that, because it was normally not like him. We chatted for a tiny bit, and he ended it with, "Happy holidays." Fast forward a month, and I have to make his rent payment call. He didn't answer, so I left a voicemail. He didn't return the call, which was unusual because he literally just lays in bed all day, so I thought it was odd he didn't see the message on his phone. For a few days, I kept calling, and at this point, rent was past due. I believe my last voicemail to him, I said I was worried about him. I had told my boss what was going on, and keep in mind, this was a new boss, and she had only started about 2 months prior and did not know much about Charles. She was concerned, so we decided to just go up to his apartment to knock. This is where I can say my life honestly changed. The moment I stepped foot outside the elevator and walked to his apartment, I stopped dead in my tracks and felt the blood rush from my face. I looked at my boss and said, "I smell something." I almost had a panic attack and began pounding on his door to no answer. His apartment was at the end of the hallway in a corner, so no one had passed his apartment and could not smell anything. I immediately called 911 for a wellness check, and when the fire department got there, I went up with them and gave them the rundown. They were familiar with Charles because he had called 911 in the past, and they knew he did not take care of himself. I remember unlocking the door for them, and as soon as they opened the door, it was like a flood of putrid and energy came rushing out. This was during the time where we had to wear masks, so luckily I had one on, or I would have lost my lunch. I had never smelled a decomposed body before, and people who have are right. It's so bad it's indescribable. I remember being somewhat in denial, but as the fire department walked in, they turned and stopped and looked down at the floor where I couldn't see. One of the firemen came out, slowly closed the door behind him, and locked eyes with me and shook his head. I immediately bawled. I felt so guilty for not knowing or getting him help sooner. I called my boss downstairs and sobbed, saying Charles is dead. I remember that evening taking the elevator down, but just running down the hall and down the stairs. By the time I was on the first floor and running to the office, I was still sobbing and ran into my maintenance supervisor. He immediately asked what was wrong, and I again said, "Charles is dead." We knew this day would come, and we knew it was going to be a hell of a unit turn due to the damage. I collapsed in my boss's office, crying, and one of the firemen came down and asked for his file to see if there was an emergency contact. His ex-wife happened to be that, so over the days we had to contact her and get with our attorney to make sure we were doing the correct steps as she was next of kin. I remember the fireman looking at me and saying that we knew he was not taking care of himself, such as taking his insulin and medications, and this was bound to happen unfortunately. He told me he most likely was walking to the bathroom, got dizzy and collapsed on the hall floor, and did not wake up. He said his body was there for at least a week. I remember feeling so guilty and wondering what his last thoughts were. Was he thinking of me? Why would I be selfish and wonder that? My boss told me the only reason why we found him was because the sweet downstairs assistant was the last and only one to truly care about him. That stuck with me. His last few months, he was finally given a glimpse of normality by talking to me on the phone and of me going to his apartment for human interaction. It was my first encounter dealing with death physically so close, so seeing the process was surreal, especially seeing him wheeled out in a black bag on a gurney. I'm grateful I did not physically see him dead, and will only remember seeing him smile for the first and last time, knowing I finally got through to him. I hope he finally is at peace. Based on the way you described Charles's life, this was as close to a eulogy as he probably ever had, so in some ways this is actually quite sweet, so thanks for sharing, and yeah. Not me, but this guy I've known for a long time. He went on an early morning run and saw someone near a pond just off the trail he was running. He figured someone maybe had heat stroke and passed out, so he went down to the pond to check on her. She was dead. He called 911, ran to the trailhead, and guided them back to the body. Turns out, she was a college student who had been abducted and murdered the night before. He tries to play it cool when he tells the story, but he only tells it when he's had a few drinks, and he gets agitated whenever anyone asks questions about it. It seems clear to me that the whole ordeal messed him up pretty bad. I think part of it is that he feels bad that a 20-year-old got killed for no apparent reason, and they never found the killer. I was 9 and saw a naked dead body behind a snowdrift. I live in Canada, so lots of snow, and they're really tall at the edge of the road, then taper down the rest of the boulevard because of snow clearing. Me and the other kids in our neighborhood used to climb to them all the way home. Small town, and we lived 2 blocks away, and we would pretend we were climbing a mountain. Anyways, we got to where it tapered off, and we couldn't do it anymore for a bit on our street. I was the last one to get down, and before I did, I glanced at this huge snow boulder tucked behind the drift, like a slightly oversized base for a snowman, and I saw bare shoulders, white skin, and dark hair under it. I was in shock, and didn't say anything to any of the other kids or my brother. I went home, sat on the couch, and kept trying to tell my mom and dad, but I couldn't make myself. I couldn't really wrap my head around it. Thank goodness someone found and reported it that evening. Small town, and we saw all the lights coming from the end of the street. Whoever reads this here are the only people I've ever told. Naked guy in a snowbank in the winter in Canada. Must have been a lot of Molson out there. Not to make light of it. I went to go do a portable chest x-ray on a patient. Kind of a daily thing for a lot of ICU patients, where around 3 a.m., I'd go to all the floors with a portable x-ray machine and do a one-view chest x-ray on each patient that needed one. I would have anywhere from between 15 and 30 to do in a couple hours, period, so I usually had no time to goof around. I walk into the room and something felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. There was no noise, no machinery running. Complete silence is rare in the ICUs, but I didn't notice this at the time. I looked at the patient, and I'm used to most ICU patients being unconscious when I x-ray them, but before I go do my x-ray thing, I just stopped and stared at the guy's face. I don't know why, but something clicked, and I thought to myself, this man is dead. Probably because he was both not intubated and was also not breathing on his own. But I wasn't thinking about that consciously. The thought process was more of a gut feeling. Just then, the nurse came in after me like, hey, sorry, we were supposed to cancel that. And I responded, yeah, I see that. I'll just cancel it when I get back down, no big deal. I walked out into the hallway, made a note on his requisition to cancel the order when I got back to the department. Then I silently took a moment to appreciate the fact that I still had about 50 or 60 years to go before I was in that same position, and just went down the hall to the next patient. Was at work, knew he was dead the moment I saw him, called 911. Work forbade me from doing CPR, and I was no longer certified, so I hesitated, but then I did it anyway. It didn't work though. When the EMTs arrived, they said there was no electricity left in his heart. He was also on a bed and too heavy for me to move, so the chest compressions didn't do anything much because the mattress absorbed them. Even if it would have made no difference though, I am still disgusted with myself for my hesitation. I had only done CPR once before that, and that one had been successful, although I suspect she still had a pulse, even if I couldn't find it at the time. I was in high school being driven by my mom. The car was stopped on a pole and surrounded by cables. I didn't know if anyone was dead. I just insisted my mom not turn onto the main street and call 911. She said we had somewhere to be, and someone else will call. I pointed out that 1, it looked like everyone else thought the same thing, and 2, God would understand why we were late to the church. I was walking home from the pub quite drunk on a cold night about 3 months ago, and just out of my eye line, there was an almighty smash. One car was in the road, with the engine block ripped clean out of it. The other was perched up on a wall, having crossed the path I was walking on seconds before. The door was ripped clean off. I climbed up, and the guy in the driver's seat was stone dead. It was odd when I tried to get a response. Unconscious people have some muscle tone, but this was like pulling on a slab of meat. I then climbed across him to the passenger and pulled on his coat. He was still alive and groaned. He later died when they tried to get him into the ambulance. At this point, a fire truck just happened to be going by and took control of the incident. They asked me what happened, then asked me to stand aside. There's a couple of military airfields nearby that share a fire service, and the truck happened to be returning to the main one. The other car with the engine ripped out, the guy survived with serious but not life-threatening injuries. It was only the next morning that I found out the 2 guys that died were actually my work colleagues, who I was with only 6 hours earlier. It was dark, I was drunk, and didn't think to check identities. The mood at work the next morning was rather deflated. So, my immediate reaction? Well, it was to try and help, inebriated as I was. Wasn't me, but it was my mom and stepdad. They were driving down A1A in Daytona Beach, and they parked to sit at the beach with our husky, and they looked over and saw 2 men pulling a dead or pretty much almost dead male in his mid-40s out of the bed of a truck. The 2 men pulled him behind a building and walked back in the truck and left. So my mom and stepdad checked on the man to see if he was okay. Turns out he was overdosing on fentanyl, and my mom and stepdad always carry Narcan on them because you never know when you could come into contact with a drug and needed it. So they pulled out 2 doses of Narcan and sprayed it in his nose. This man was dead, and my mom saved his life with Narcan. So if you ever see any Narcan, buy it. You never know when you're going to have to save yourself or somebody else. Coworker's patient hung himself. Shock was my first reaction. Help cut him down. Placed him on the floor. Felt for a pulse. Felt scared as F and started CPR. Felt ribs crack. Remember looking at the ligature mark, thinking it looked like the end of the balloon where you tie it off. Thought that if we could inflate his neck like you inflate a balloon to get rid of the ligature mark, he would make it. Code team ran in, asked us to lift patient onto gurney. Brain couldn't comprehend why they couldn't just code a patient on the floor. Someone took over CPR, and I walked out of the room and started sobbing. Sucked it up and attended to my patient who needed need. Left work and felt traumatized and sad. Couldn't stop thinking about that family. I think regardless of the setting or professional background, seeing someone in that situation would be even a little traumatizing. I don't think anyone would just be like, oh, hey, there's a human being hanging. Cool. So, hope you're doing all right. I found my best friend. He was hours gone, so CPR didn't even occur to me since he was super dead. I grabbed my phone. It immediately died. Looked in his bag for his phone, and when I moved his overclothes, pills flew everywhere. Couldn't find his phone out, so I took my phone outside to hook it up to my car charger and call 911. I really regret not taking a minute to just sit there with him, just touch his back and say a quick goodbye. But I was young and scared. I knew there was no coming back at that point. He was long gone. Turns out, he died moments after I tucked him in. OD. He seemed totally sober to me the night before, and I felt good knowing he was safe with me the night before. I was wrong.